Hi, I'm Jason Gorber for ThatShelf.com, and we're here to talk today about some ridiculous records. Look, the vinyl collection scene has gone through all kinds of waves, obviously. Right up until the advent of compact disc, it was the most dominant form of music. But we've seen the ebbs and flows of the collectability of these records. I think as many people, I'm not by no means the first person to say this, as more and more people sort of gorged on wonderful chaos of digital music, your ability to almost get any song that's ever been made, there's something to be said about the ritual of sitting and listening to music, especially on vinyl. A lot of people are finding that quite excellent. I come from a very different position. I have thousands of records and continue to have thousands of records. But equally, I collected many digital recordings, and I have found, as I've gotten better and better systems, the ability to delineate between different recordings. So some sound better on vinyl, some sound better on digital, and some sound just different on either. And so it's actually sometimes quite fun and interesting to actually have the same record to hear different decisions made by pressing engineers and mastering engineers and all these things that do drive you nuts as you sort of look for what you would think would be a definitive version. It's like, this is the one that I'm going to have, and if I'm ever going to listen to the album, this is the way I'm going to listen to it. And frankly, for some of the great albums, the greatest albums ever made, that's simply not the way that it sort of stands out, unfortunately. Now, there are certain companies that obviously cater to people who are much more worried about how the record sounded more than anything else. Even back in the time when that really was secondary to what was going on. During the 1970s, during the oil crisis, the actual vinyl, the actual records themselves in the United States were particularly atrocious. And so many people look to countries like Japan, who are beautifully and wonderfully neurotic about stuff like this and always have been. Their meticulous attention to detail is legendary, especially in the record collecting community. Now, that being said, often Japanese presses, things that are done for the local Japanese market, are EQ'd in a very distinct way, or frankly, the way that they're actually mastered for vinyl is often done very differently than it is in, let's say, Europe or North America, where they're basically not paying as much attention to the low end and cranking a little bit the high end. In other words, you have what's on the tape, which frankly, we're never really meant to hear. The master tape was always meant to go through this secondary process whereby what was on the tape was going to be pressed onto vinyl or put into whatever other format it was going to be put on. Think of it as a film negative before it firmly is color corrected, and then that color correction is sort of put out on answer prints and release prints and all that stuff. That's the analog way of thinking about movies. The same kind of thing took place with records. What that does mean is that the master tape, ideally, it's the first pressings that tend to be the most definitive versions before the tape gets worn through multiple pressings, especially for popular records. It means the original stampers, the actual metal plates that they actually use to make the records, ideally in a first pressing, are the best of the best. But that's challenged sometimes by the fact that the original vinyl itself, the actual physical record, sometimes you could have all the greatest elements to work with, and then you're pressing it, and then it just becomes a mess because the vinyl itself is noisy and cracky. Or to find one that's in good shape after all these decades becomes near impossible. So you had companies like Mobile Fidelity that came along that catered towards a very, very niche audience back then who had these crazy systems where hypothetically you could hear the difference between what was being played on your sort of junky turntable and something that was much more robust and could actually tell the difference. And they tried really hard to get original master tapes, the original master recording logo, and from there they would press in Japan. So this would be American style equalization and all those elements, but pressed in Japan. The mastering decisions, the elements of taking it from the tape to the record, will be done on basically European or North American standards. In other words, worrying about the low end as much as they are about the high end, not having crazy equalization. Now, there were a number of recordings that were done by this company that had what is called the smile equalization, where they would bump the highs and bump the lows, do sort of what the Japanese did and a little bit what some North Americans did, and that really changed the characteristics. Some of them are less good than others. But nonetheless, if you want to get a vintage record that is as close to the master tape as possible, that has been pressed by people who are really worried about such things, Mobile Fidelity collectors are well aware that it's a really good way to seek out. Now, some vintage Mobile Fidelity records are very expensive and very hard to find. This is the second Led Zeppelin album on Mobile Fidelity. Some people like this pressing, some people don't. I find it actually quite excellent, particularly in my setup. I do not have a first pressing Robert Ludwig. There's an entire story about what happened with this record. But for me, for a record that I listen to once in a while, this is my sort of go-to version on vinyl. The newest pressing that you can get is a digital pressing, which is not always an issue. Sometimes when the master tapes have deteriorated, for example, the digital master is the best available master, and if care and attention is actually brought to detail, the pressing to vinyl can actually be substantially better than even a first pressing, because if you have better vinyl, better mastering, it'll make up for any of the limitations that are actually inherent in that transfer. So with something like Led Zeppelin 2, a vintage MOFI, this is what it looks like. You then have more contemporary MOFIs. Again, the Bob Dylan series has been extraordinary. These are on 45 RPM, and you have simply extraordinary presentations from the original analog tapes of the Bob Dylan catalog. There's this ability that Columbia Records gave to Mobile Fidelity in order to press these. These are different, because they're on 45 RPM, because they're limited edition, it allows a more robust, more audiophile-oriented pressing and presentation of these records than a regular Columbia release. So I had the Columbia Mono box set, which was fantastic, but I picked up the MOFIs, and the MOFIs just simply were better. It's not always the case, but definitely in the Bob Dylan, it was certainly the case. Sometimes you actually get crazy box sets like this. This is obviously some more Dylan, again, 45 RPM. And in this type of box, you get basically, you know, your usual stuff. A little bit of foam, your book, detailing all the original materials, and in these beloved and welcome MOFI sleeves. There's rice paper sleeves with plastic on the outside. All of my records are stored in these types of sleeves. This is the way to go for me. Obviously, Mobile Fidelity, MOFI, does this thing. And because this record is so long, with 45 RPM, we actually have 3 records in here, each in its individual sleeve. And that's sort of a regular 45 RPM, let's call it a deluxe-ish box of a regular MOFI 45 RPM release. So this is what they've done. The pressing, they're great. They're extraordinary. Now, of course, because they know who they're selling to, lunatics such as me, they have a new process that they're calling One Step. And there's a number of boxes, including one by Dylan, where they take, presumably, I guess the best way of thinking about it is extraordinary records and giving it extraordinary treatment. And the latest one that they've come out is Mingus's Now, these are numbered boxes. My number is 5599 out of 6,000. It's hand numbered on the bottom here. And these records use a process that's called the one-step pressing. Now, it sounds, as well it should, like something that's just a marketing gimmick. Like, what's the big deal? How can this 45, the Bob Dylan 45 RPM set with multiple discs, really be, quote-unquote, that much worse than this? Well, annoyingly, these really are really good. Here we have Charles Mingus's which is a numbered box set. I have number 5599 hand numbered on the back. And what the one-step process denotes, and why it's slightly different than this normal 45 RPM type box, it's ideally the definitive version of the record. Now, I already said that there'll be different versions that you may actually want to look for, but as far as I'm concerned on vinyl, this is the one that I'm going to pull out and listen to. It is 45 RPM, like the Dylan, but what they've done is use a different process to actually go in manufacturing to ideally not only limit the number that are actually produced, but do so in a way which is as close to the original as possible. It's using a top-level formulation of the vinyl. It's done in much smaller numbers with ideally greater care. Look, I mean, they've already sort of done that with these. Most of these only have 5,000 pressings. But this one step really does seem to take it to another level. And frankly, it just makes you feel better. It's so much of music is psychological at the best of times. And so, yes, you can hear the difference. Is the difference worth the, dollar difference between this set and this set? I leave that up to you. But for me, for these records that I've actually purchased from these series, the difference really has been quite extraordinary. Now, if you open up the box, you get nice shiny gold box. I put the sticker here because I'm neurotic that way. It comes with these foam toppers. Now, I'm actually not sure. You can actually let me know in the comments. I am worried that after many years, this foam stuff might actually begin to disintegrate. You would think that they'd put that into consideration when they're actually putting this stuff together, but I am worried that this foam might get sticky or something like that. They may be using a different version of this that I don't know about that doesn't have to worry about that. Certainly in terms of preservation, I do not want the foam to somehow, decades hence, destroy my records. This is definitely an investment for the future, and this is what I want to actually have it stay in place. Because it's Mingus, we have some beautiful photographs here of Trelly himself. This one actually comes with 2 photos. They don't always. Some of them come with, like in the Simon & Garfunkel, it comes with this really terrible looking still. But nonetheless, more Mingus. And then here we have the ubiquitous one-step ultra disc process discussion about what's going on. So you can see here, I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous to explain by camera, but nonetheless, we have here what the one step does. It seems very official, doesn't it? But basically, we have fewer processes. And because of that, because of fewer stages, hypothetically, it sounds better. So what they're doing here, again, is on a traditional pressing, is you go from the lacquer, you create basically a positive and a negative. You create a father, then a mother. And from there, you create the stamper. That's the actual thing. So the lacquer is very, very fragile. That's what actually will create the metal plate, the stamper. And so from the lacquer, you can generate sort of in-between steps in order to make sure that this element is preserved for many thousands of pressings that you're going to do. And then you create all the fathers and mothers that you want. You then create multiple stampers for what you're actually going to be pressing, and that's how you get to the vinyl. Whereas with the Ultra Disc 1, you are closer. You're going straight from the lacquer right to what they call the convert, the negative, and then straight to vinyl. And so that means you're basically pressing as close to the lacquer as possible. You're pressing as close to the actual thing that got etched by the lathe as you possibly can in vinyl production. That's basically the shtick that they're going with. Now, does it make a difference? For me, audio-wise, it does. But it's also true that the records that they're choosing already sound pretty bloody extraordinary. You got stuff like Yes, It's Fragile. You have, again, Bob Dylan titles, Simon & Garfunkel titles. They're great. Also inside, they actually replicate sort of the original album artwork as a one-off with the MOFI on top. This is sort of what a sort of standalone MOFI release would look like with the original master recording, the OMR recording on top. And then the back, a replication of the original text. And then each set comes in its individual sleeve. And inside each sleeve is a white protection. On other MOFIs, this often includes advertisements for what is forthcoming. But inside here, we have in the MOFI sleeve the 45 RPM version of this record. Now, we got 2 of these. What is the advantage of 45 RPM? Why do we bother? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, this allows, obviously, MOFI to actually release this because the 33 RPM version is probably with the studio. But in terms of sound quality, what it is if you look at how records actually play, the outside ring actually allows you to have greater bass and greater detail. As you get towards the inside, things actually have to get a little bit quieter and a little bit less bass. It mattered then what order you put songs on. It mattered then that you would put your big heavy stuff on the outside and things would have to get a little bit lighter as you went inside on a 33 RPM record. That's simply the way that it worked in terms of physics. As you go, the groove spacing and all those elements actually change as you go inside. With 45 RPM, it allows you to do 2 things. First of all, you have a much longer area to actually allow the reproduction of a given frequency. So the reason 12-inch singles, for example, are often played in 45 is because you get a much richer bass on vinyl. Now, if we want to get on what are we going to get the most signal-noise ratio, obviously we could go digital, but that's a whole nother story. On vinyl, you always had these compromises, everything from the RIA curve to what you're pressing, to the different layers, to the spacing between, to mono versus stereo, all those which allow you to have different groove depths and different bass response and stuff like that. That's always been the case. But here, what we have is dead quiet vinyl and spinning at a higher revolution, obviously 45 RPM, which allows the record to have a much wider space between the label and where the music ends. In other words, instead of spreading it fully out right to the end, they actually try to keep it as close to this edge as possible while still giving enough groove distance to actually replicate the song. That actually allows for the highest possible fidelity that you're going to get from one of these crazy shiny things. By doing that, you are getting the most out of a vinyl record. Now, does it mean that you got to get up and change the record twice as often as you were before? Yes, it does. Does it mean that certain records are actually in some ways compromised? For example, a record like Aqualung, which is coming out in 45 RPM, was meant to be two sides. Side A was one continuous song, side B was another continuous song. That's going to be split up, so it'll be interesting to see how they actually do that. Live recordings, the same thing. Things fade out in different ways that they did before. It's always going to be compromises. But while you're listening to the song, while you're actually there, while you're actually witnessing it, this is the way to go. You get lovely little gold embossed elements. It shows the tracks on the back. In this case, it's literally 2 songs on side 3, 2 songs on side 4. That's the way it works. All stored in this one box. How does it sound? I'm about to put it on. I will let you know. But more importantly, for me, is that I have finally a version of this record that I think is going to last me as long as I'm listening to music. I think that I love this record. I love Joni Mitchell, and I come to Mingus from Joni Mitchell. For those of you that don't know, he was an extraordinary songwriter, totally weird duck, amazing jazz artist, bass player, multi-instrumentalist, primarily known for his bass. But the songs that he would craft were this haunting mix between really beautiful melodic lines and very interesting and esoteric jazz moments that made things sort of dive into a very different direction. He had the ability to twist music in a way which is quite extraordinary. Again, as somebody who's a huge fan of Joni Mitchell, coming to his music through her appreciation and her love of him, the second track here, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, she actually, on her Mingus record, puts lyrics on top of it. We actually have his birthday party, for example, on her record. Now, on that recording, you have the extraordinary Jaco Pastorius laying in this beautiful bass work. Again, a titan of bass working with the music of another titan of bass, clotting all at the same time. So, for me, the one step is sort of the way to go. It's a fortune. I wish it wasn't, but this kind of care, this kind of attention to detail is what you get at the sort of high level. And really, this is what has brought me back into collecting records. I bought a record player which allowed me to hear the differences, and now the companies are finally, for the most part, paying attention and giving us presentations and recordings of some of the greatest albums ever made as good or better than they've ever been. And that's quite extraordinary. The Led Zeppelin, for example, Led Zeppelin 2, this version of the MOFI, again, I could buy the new Jimmy Page remastered version. I have the 24-192 files if I want to listen to his restoration of that. This, for me, sounds a little bit better, a little bit closer to what I believe the music was intending to sound like at the time. What's fantastic about this is it's being done by people with such beautiful levels of neurosis that they are presenting this as close as possible to the intentions at the time, using the best and most appropriate technology of today to get the most out of this beautiful analog medium. So for thatshelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. This is our dive into mobile fidelity and its latest one-step presentation. If there's other records you want us to look at or other elements that you want us to give a chance to actually dive into, please leave us some comments below. Please subscribe, please ring the bell so you can see when our next video arrives, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Take care.